Good morning, team. All right, here we are back with holes. We are on chapter 36, page 160. Today we're going to read two chapters, 36 and 37. So here we go. They put 4 of the unbroken jars in the burlap sack in case they might be able to use them. Stanley carried the sack and Zero held the shovel. I should warn you, Stanley said. I'm not exactly the luckiest guy in the world. Zero wasn't worried. When you spend your whole life living in a hole, he said, the only way you can go is up. That's a nice motto, I feel. Anyway, they gave each other the thumbs up sign, then headed out. It was the hottest part of the day, and Stanley's empty canteen was still strapped around his neck. He thought back to the water truck and wished he'd at least stopped and filled his canteen before running off. They hadn't gone very far before Zero had another attack. He clutched his stomach and he let himself fall to the ground. Stanley could only wait for it to pass. The sploosh had saved Zero's life, but now it was destroying him from the inside. He wondered how long it would be before he too felt the effects. He looked at the big thumb. It didn't seem any closer than when he had first started out. Zero took a deep breath and managed to sit up. Can you walk? Stanley asked him. Just give me a sec, Zero said. He took another breath then. Using the shovel, he pulled himself back to his feet. He gave Stanley the thumbs up sign, and they continued. Sometimes Stanley would try to go for a long while without looking at the big thumb. He'd make a mental snapshot of how it looked, then wait maybe 10 minutes before looking back at it again to see if it seemed closer. It never did. It was like chasing the moon. And if they ever reached it, he realized, they'd still have to climb it. I wonder who she was, said Zero. Who? Mary Lou, said Zero. Stanley smiled. I guess she was once a real person on a real lake. It's hard to imagine. I bet she was pretty, said Zero. Somebody must have loved her too to name the boat after her. Yeah, said Stanley. I bet she looked great in a bathing suit, sitting in the boat with her boyfriend rowing. 'Cause do you remember who Mary Lou was? Yeah, it was Sam's donkey. Zero used the shovel as a third leg. 2 legs weren't enough to keep him up. I gotta stop and rest, he said after a while. Stanley looked at Big Thumb. It still didn't look any closer. He was afraid if Zero stopped, he might never get started again. We're almost there, he said. He wondered which was closer, Camp Green Lake or the Big Thumb. I really have to sit down. Just see if you can go a little. Zero collapsed. The shovel stayed up a fraction of a second longer, perfectly balanced on the tip of the blade. Then it fell next to him. Zero knelt, bent over with his head in the ground, and Stanley could hear a very low, moaning sound coming from him. He looked at the shovel and he couldn't help but think that he might have to dig Zero a grave. Zero's last hole. And who will dig a grave for me? He thought. But Zero did get up, once again flashing a thumbs up. Give me some words, he said. Stanley took a few seconds to realize what he meant. Then he smiled and said, R-U-N. Zero sounded it out to himself. Run. Run. Good. F-U-N. Fun. The spelling seemed to help Zero. It gave him something to concentrate on beside his pain and weakness. It distracted Stanley as well. The next time he looked at the thumb, it did seem closer. They quit spelling words when it hurt too much to talk. Stanley's throat was dry, and he was weak and exhausted. Yet as bad as he felt, he knew that Zero felt 10 times worse. As long as Zero could keep going, he could keep going too. It was possible, he thought. He hoped that he didn't get any of the bad bacteria. Zero hadn't been able to unscrew the lid. Maybe that means the bad germs couldn't get in either. Maybe the bacteria were only the jars which opened easy, the ones he had now been carrying in his sack. What scared Stanley the most wasn't about dying wasn't his actual death. He figured he could handle the pain. It wouldn't be much worse than how he felt now. In fact, maybe that moment of death, he would be too weak to feel pain, and death would be a relief. What worried him the most was the thought of his parents not knowing what happened to him, not knowing whether he was dead or alive. He hated to imagine what would it be like for his mother and father, day after day, month after month, not knowing, living on false hope. For him, at least, it would be over. For his parents, the pain would never end. He wondered if the warden would send out a search party to look for him. It didn't seem likely. She didn't send anyone to look for Zero. But no one cared about Zero. They simply destroyed his files. But Stanley had a family, and she couldn't pretend he was never there. He wondered what she would tell them, and when. "What do you think's up there?" Zero asked. Stanley looked at the top of the big thumb. "Oh, probably an Italian restaurant," he said. Zero managed to laugh. "I think I'll get a pepperoni pizza and a large root beer," said Stanley. "I want an ice cream sundae," said Zero, "with nuts and whipped cream and bananas and hot fudge." The sun was almost directly in front of them, and the thumb pointed up toward it. They came to the end of the lake. Huge white stone cliffs rose before them. Unlike the eastern shore, where Camp Green Lake was situated, the western shore did not slope down gradually. It was as if they had been walking across the flat bottom of a giant frying pan, and now they had to somehow climb up out of it. They could no longer see the big thumb. The cliffs blocked their view, and the cliffs also blocked out the sun. Zero groaned and clutched his stomach, but he remained standing. "I'm all right," he whispered. Suddenly, Stanley saw a rut. A rut is like a little hole that you can climb or put your hand in. About a foot wide and 6 inches deep, running down a cliff. On either side of the rut were a series of ledges. "Let's try there," he said. It looked to be about a 50-foot climb, straight up. Stanley still managed to hold the sack of jars in his left hand as he slowly moved up from ledge to ledge, crisscrossing the rut. At times, he had to use the side of the rut for support in order to make it to the next ledge. Zero stayed with him, somehow, and his frail body trembled terribly as he climbed the stone wall. Some of the ledges were wide enough to sit on, others stuck out no more than a few inches, just enough for a quick step. Stanley stopped about 2/3 of the way up, on a fairly wide ledge, and Zero came up alongside him. "You okay?" Stanley asked. Zero gave the thumbs up sign, and Stanley did the same. He looked above him. He wasn't sure how he'd get to the next ledge. It was 3 or 4 feet above his head, and he didn't see any footholds. He was afraid to look down. "Give me a boost," said Zero. "Then I'll pull you up with my shovel." "You won't be able to pull me up," said Stanley. "Yes, I will," said Zero. Stanley cupped his hands together, and Zero stepped onto his interwoven fingers until he was able to lift Zero high enough for him to grab the protruding slab of rock. Protruding means sticking out. Stanley continued to help him from below as Zero pulled himself onto the ledge. While Zero was getting himself situated up there, Stanley attached the sack to the shovel by poking a hole through the burlap. He held it up to Zero. Zero grabbed hold of the sack first, then the shovel. He set the shovel so that half of the blade was supported by the rock slab. The wooden shaft hung down toward Stanley. "Okay," he said. Stanley doubted this would work. It was one thing for him to lift Zero, who was half his weight. It was quite another for Zero to try to pull him up. Stanley grabbed hold of the shovel as he climbed up the rock wall, using the sides of the rut to help support him. His hands moved one over the other, up the shaft of the shovel. He felt Zero's hands clasp his wrists. He let go of the shaft with one hand and grabbed the top of the ledge. He gathered his strength for the brief second seemed to defy gravity as he took a quick step up the wall and, with Zero's help, pulled himself the rest of the way over the ledge. He caught his breath, and there was no way he could have done that a few months ago. He noticed a large spot of blood on his wrists, and he took himself a moment to realize that it was Zero's blood. Zero had deep gashes in both his hands. He had held on to the metal blade of the shovel, keeping it in its place as Zero climbed. Zero brought his hands to his mouth and sucked up the blood. One of the glass jars had broken in the sack, so they decided to save the pieces. They might need to make a knife or something. They rested briefly, then continued on up. It was a fairly easy climb to the rest of the way, and when they reached flat ground, Stanley looked up to see the sun, a firing ball balancing on top of the thumb. God was twirling a basketball. Soon they were walking in a long, thin shadow of the thumb. Okay, so they're getting there. They're getting close. Oh, here we go. Chapter 37. We're almost there, said Stanley. He could see the base of the mountain. Now that they were almost there, it scared him. Big Thumb was his only hope. If there was no water, no refuge meaning like safety, then they'd have nothing, not even hope. There was no exact place where the flat land stopped and the mountain began. The ground began to get steeper and steeper, and then there was no doubt that they were heading up the mountain. Stanley could no longer see Big Thumb. The slope of the mountain was in the way. It became too steep to go straight up. Instead, they zigzagged back and forth, increasing their altitude. Altitude means going up, by small increments every time they changed directions. This is called switchbacking. It's when you can't go up, so you kind of have to go across and up, and then across and up, and across and up. It's slower, but that way you don't just go straight up. You kind of go, it's easier. It's called switchbacking. You'll see it on lots of hikes if you hike to the top of like a tall mountain. Okay, patches of weeds dotted the mountainside. They walked from one patch to another, using the weeds as footholds. As they got higher, the weeds got thicker. Many had thorns, and they'd been careful walking through them. Stanley would have liked to stop and rest, but he was afraid they'd never get started again. As long as Zero could keep going, he could keep going too. Besides, he knew they didn't have much daylight left. As the sky darkened, bugs began appearing from the weed patches. A swarm of gnats hovered around them and attracted by their sweat. Neither Stanley nor Zero had the strength to swat at them. "How are you doing?" Stanley asked. Zero pointed thumbs up, and then he said, "If a gnat lands on me, it will knock me over." Stanley gave him some more words. B-U-G-S, he spelled. Zero concentrated hard, then said, "Boogs." Stanley laughed. A wide smile spread across Zero's sick and weary face as well. "Bugs," he said. "Good," said Stanley. "Remember, if it's a short U, if there's no E at the end." Okay, here's a hard one. How about L-U-N-C-H? Suddenly, Zero started to make a horrible wrenching noise as he doubled over and grabbed his stomach. His frail body shook violently and he threw up, emptying his stomach of the sploosh. He leaned on his knees and took several deep breaths. Then he straightened up and continued going. The swarm of gnats stayed behind, preferring the contents of Zero's stomach to the sweat on the boy's face. Stanley didn't give him any more words, thinking that he needed to save his strength. But about 10 or 15 minutes later, Zero said, "Lunch." As they climbed higher, the patches of weeds grew thicker, and they had to be careful not to get their feet tangled in the thorny vines. Stanley suddenly realized something. There hadn't been any weeds on the lake. "Weeds and bugs," he said. "There's got to be water around somewhere. We must be getting close." A wide, clown-like smile spread across Zero's face, and he flashed the thumbs-up sign, then fell. He didn't get up. Stanley bent over him. "Come on, Zero," he urged. "We're getting close. Come on, Hector. Weeds and bugs, weeds and boogs." Suddenly, Stanley shook him. "I've already ordered you a hot fudge sundae," he said. "They're making it right now." But Zero said nothing. All right, guys, you have to wait or just go to the next video to find out what happens to Zero. Okay, go log on to Teams and you have questions on there to answer about that section. All right, bye, guys.